I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from a guest who manages to upset both figures from the right and the left. He's a bit hard to pin down, although I'd say he's a thinker grounded in a bygone era of social democrats. And I think he's worth listening to, whether you agree or disagree with him on some issues. You know, there's something to be learned, especially with his latest article. The guest that I'm talking about is urban theorist Joel Kotkin, author of such books as The New Class Conflict and The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, a warning to the global middle class. And we're going to be discussing his article at UnHerd entitled Beware the New Eugenics, in which he takes aim at the world of Silicon Valley, the ideology of transhumanism, and big tech's flirtations with anti-human and anti-humanist lines of thought. Like I said, you may not agree with Joel on everything. I know I have listeners on both the right and the left, but I think this is an important conversation to have. There needs to be, I would say, a bipartisan conversation about some of these really deeply anti-human big tech figures. And you have to remember, Silicon Valley's influence on American politics is growing. So that's what Joel and I talk about. Hope you'll enjoy the conversation. We also talk a little bit about Donald Trump closer to the end of the episode and Joel's frustrations with both the Republican and Democratic parties. With that being said, let's get right to it with Joel Kotkin. Welcome to Parallax Views. A guest that I'm very interested to be speaking with. He's hard to place politically. We were just talking about this off air, but you know, he's a very original thinker that has written books like The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, a warning to the global middle class. And we're going to be talking about his article, Beware the New Eugenics, at UnHerd. I'm talking about Joel Kotkin, who also, I know this is going to be out of left field, Joel, but you wrote one of my favorite pieces in the Washington Post, because I'm a cinephile, I love movies. You wrote a piece about Charles Bronson back in the 70s called Charles Bronson, An Enduring Belief in the American Superhero. You actually interviewed him. And that was like so awesome when I first discovered. I was doing like a whole research project on Bronson. That's how I first found your work, actually.
Well, and one of the funny things about Bronson was he the nicest guy you could ever run into. Incredibly open and easy to talk to. You know, you're always surprised when I used to work for the Post and I was covering a lot of Hollywood stuff. You'd be surprised that people you maybe thought were great ended up being complete jerks, and people that you thought would probably be hard asses turned out to be really nice. So, what can you tell?
So I'm glad you let me mention that, because I love that article. But we got to talk about this piece you wrote, which I was touched by, entitled Beware the New Eugenics, Who Decides What Humans Become? And I was telling you off air that both yourself and Michael Lind have been covering this a great deal. Michael, I believe a year ago or so, wrote a piece entitled Beware the Eugenicons, or something
Yes,
along
yes.
those lines. I think you both are really hitting on something that's very real and very dangerous that is getting overlooked. So maybe you could talk to my listeners about how you came to talk and look at the subject of the new eugenics. What has you concerned, and where do you see the warning signs right now?
Well, first of all, like most things that I do, I look at history and what the trajectory is. And the trajectory on eugenics has been there really since they were able to do the very basic biological analysis. And then obviously they got into, when you get into genetics. But there's been increasingly attempts to, if you will, cull the herd. In other words, we want to have more of this and less of that. Um, and I think that what you tend to see is, as the technology gets stronger, the ability to essentially have eugenics, in other words, to essentially if you want to call it artificial selection, you you have you have the tools there, and there's a certain degree of understanding that do we need to have babies born who are going to be unable to do anything? Well, there are certainly issues that can be discussed. On the other hand, I think that the tendency as technology gets stronger to become more and more intrusive because you're able to do much more. And as Daniel Bell, I think the most important book, I think, in many ways of the last century was The Coming of Post-Industrial Society. And what Bell could tell even many decades ago is that if you have this capacity, the desire of those who control the technologies to use it for the purposes of what they think is the betterment of humanity, becomes very, very tempting. And of course, you look at Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. I think probably the most important view of where the future is going, written even to date. Um, and so what you've got is you've got this technology. Now, the big change today, and is in the past, eugenics were basically a governmental or a state-oriented thing. Obviously, the most horrendous case being Germany, but there were all sorts of attempts to, in the United States in particular, to limit this population or that population. So these things have existed for a long time. What's different today is much of this is taking place in the private sector. This is taking place outside of government. I mean, government. I'm not urging the government be involved, but I think that what we have, and this is what the key of neo-feudalism is, we now have companies that have revenues bigger than major countries. I mean, you know, Apple can be worth more than Mexico. I mean, you have these kinds of unbelievable historic distortions, and Nvidia just became the trillion-dollar company. I mean,
Yeah, they're not to interrupt you, but they're like these sort of they're these private transnational entities that don't have any allegiance to any
ex-
nation states.
and are run, and I think this is again where Bell's sociology is very useful, although there have been some very good pieces recently on this as well. But basically, what you have is a bunch of people who overwhelmingly they're either engineers or MBAs. Those seems to be the two groups. As AI develops, that group is going to become more elite. In other words, the people who can do this technology will be very limited, but they'll make a lot of money. And so you've got a class of people who feel very, very comfortable in using technology to essentially reform, reshape humanity. And this is happening on as you mentioned, a transnational basis. So, we can ban, for instance, cloning. But if the South Koreans who are running out of people say, well, why not? Let's clone a bunch of the best Kia engineers. I mean, so the problem is we can't stop it on the national level, and these huge multinational companies plus organizations like the Communist Party of China have such enormous resources that we couldn't control this. I think if we in terms of state action, even if we wanted to. So let's say they say, well, no cloning allowed in the EU and the US. Okay, well, what's going to stop, North Korea from doing cloning? I mean, so I mean, the question is really, where is this going? And is there anything that we can do to slow it down, stop it, or in some ways make it useful?
I also wanted to ask, in the opening, you mentioned that the New York Marxist academic David Harvey and what he calls a fetishism of technology and how
Right.
that sort of transcends conventional politics. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that. What is this fetishism of technology that he's speaking about, and why do you think it's important?
Well, I think he hit a very good thing. And one thing, I try to do with my work is I try to read widely, from the right to the left, to because I think one of the big problems we have today is that people, let's say, of a particular ideology, just will not even deal with something if the person who's writing doesn't fit their category. I think good ideas are good ideas, and interesting insights come from all sorts of people. Um, so, my sense of it is that there's a necessity, I think, to understand that there is a really strong mentality that comes out of engineering school, out of MBA school, where you tend to look at things in this, in quote, objective way, and you kind of throw out all the sort of human characteristics that made society work, like whether it's religion or political tradition or an identity based on family. All those things are thrown aside, and so what we have is this increasingly technocratic society run by people who for whom the government is just sort of like I think it's really interesting that the left is now all upset about the oligarchs, but when the oligarchs were giving them money, they were fine with it. I mean, the problem is not the ideology of oligarchy, it's the existence of oligarchy. It's the pervasiveness of oligarchy. You're always going to have some oligarchy, but the degree to which we're seeing it, and then the tools that these people have at their mind. I mean, I think of artificial intelligence and where that's going, and I mean, let's say I'm doing research and I get this immediately, this explanation, which may or may not be true because I have no way of vetting it. And so, what you have increasingly is a world. In the new book, I'm using the term, we live in an era of smart machines and dumb people.
I want to ask you, in terms of the sort of tech elites, you focus a lot in this article on everyone from Sam Altman and Mark Zuckerberg who have associated in the past or present more with Democrats. And then on the other hand, you look at figures like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel who have tried to sort of latch on to MAGA or Trump. Maybe you can talk about the differences and the overlaps between the sort of different tech oligarchs.
Well, first of all, I think they have more in common than they have different. I mean, their worldviews are different. The way they look at the world is pretty common. All these people, whether they're Trumpistas or they're progressives, support universal basic income. I mean, they do tend to believe that people are kind of redundant, most people, and that eventually we won't even need them, and that it'll be a very small group. So that's a similarity. Now, I think where there's a bit of a difference is that those techies who build products and are more affected by higher regulation tend to have been moving more towards the Republicans. And Musk, before his latest outbreak of insanity, was headed that direction. Peter Thiel, who seems to be a little more grounded, um, is is another example. But if you're involved in the world where everything is a algorithm and everything is done in cyberspace, government regulation is generally not your biggest worry. And particularly if you're Microsoft and you're Apple, a regime that favors oligopoly is a great thing. You don't want competition. One of the great ironies is that there's a whole wing of the tech world which, in a funny way, wants to destroy what made them possible in the first place.
So in terms of, I don't know if you saw it, but there was that recent interview Peter Thiel did with Ross Douthat,
Yeah.
where he was like very cautious about answering a question about whether he believes in the endurance of humanity. And that's actually the reason I reached out to you because I am noticing this sort of, I mean, I guess people on the sort of tech right or the tech elite side of things would say that they're into posthumanism or transhumanism, but
Right.
there's something that comes off as very deeply just anti-human about it all.
Oh, look, I agree completely. I mean, for instance, I mean, there's very little interest, so I find, in the conventional family or even the sponsorship of the arts and culture. One of the things that always amazes me about the Bay Area, I went to school up there. I'm in Southern California now, but in the Bay Area, you have this agglomeration of these very powerful companies and very senior management, and they fertilize each other. They live in that particular environment. And one of the big differences, I think, you mentioned the differences in companies. One of the big differences is historically, even the robber barons eventually had to deal with unions. They had to deal with, they needed working class people to do things. Now, for the tech elites, and whether they're right or left, the only usefulness of most people is being customers. They have no other particular usefulness. Actually, what you really want is you want a large number of extremely low wage workers brought in from abroad to do the tasks that you don't want to do, whether it's child raising or mowing the lawn or and almost everybody in the upper middle class does that, particularly here in California. But there isn't really that need for that, or they don't have that need for that skilled worker. I mean, so when you look at the Bay Area, it's amazing to me how little opportunity there are for working class people in the Bay Area. And also, what have the tech people left behind? You go to Florence, Italy, and yes, the Medicis and the merchant princes were, I'm sure horrible people in many ways and did unethical things, but they left behind a absolutely gorgeous city in Florence. I mean, I think the most beautiful city in the world. What has Silicon Valley left behind? Is the Bay Area nicer than it was when I went to school there, 50 years ago? I don't think so. Where are the great art museums? Where are the great concert halls? Where are the great training centers so that working class people can gain the skills so they can make a decent living? I see none of it. And one of the great ironies is you go to the opposite end of or the different end of the country in Texas, the oil guys leave behind an enormous amount of charitable activities. If you look at the Science Museum in Houston, it's quite astounding. Um, the emphasis on skills training is very strong in Texas, North Carolina, Tennessee. California is sort of evolving in a funny way into exactly the sort of tech nightmare we're talking about, where there's a small group that makes enormous amounts of money, and then there's a little bit of a group that sort of lives off that group and does okay, and everybody else is basically redundant.
In terms of tying this big tech agenda and the sort of tech oligarchs to eugenics or a new eugenics,
Right,
what do you
right,
think the best evidence is for that? Because I think you'll see glimpses of, even in like a book like Yuval Noah Harari's, I believe it was
right.
Homo Deus, he sort of alludes to it, but he doesn't like use the word eugenics. And I'm not sure he's saying, oh, this would be some great thing. He's just saying this is what he sees as happening in the future.
Right.
So oftentimes, the eugenics talk is sort of, I guess, hidden or cloaked. Can you speak to what you see as the evidence for this being really
Sure.
part of this agenda of the big
Well,
tech
take a
world?
look at the things that are being funded by the tech oligarchs. Who do they listen to? Someone like Curtis Yarvin, that I mean, he would have been very comfortable in New England in 1919, talking with all the other distinguished voices who said, well, like I remember one of my favorites was Goddard, who was one of the leading sociologists in New York at that time, making a statement that what was it like 85% of all Jewish immigrants are mentally defective. Well, you know, I I could say there are members of my family where you might want to say that, but the reality is overall they did very well. Almost all the groups that they looked at as being inferior, Italians, Irish, you go down the list, obviously Asians, uh, African Americans, and obviously they've all made progress. Some are outperforming the general population, but this idea, I think, A, is being very, they have the funding. I'm sometimes astounded who they look to for inspiration. I mean, there's some of these people are really scary. Um, and I mean, if I was a PR person advising these, people like, Thiel and Musk, I would be very reluctant to do it. And then on the other side of it, there's, obviously, Kurzweil, Ray
Right, Ray
Kurzweil.
Kurzweil, the big singularity guy. Yeah.
Right. And I did a TV taping with him years ago, and I came away saying, this is the scariest guy I've ever met. I mean, we got into this argument about I had just come back from India, and he said, well, information technology makes everything better for everybody. And I said, well, you know what? I was just in Dharavi, and I don't think it's, the fact that they have cell phones doesn't change the reality that they're living in a cellar with 12 people in one room. I just don't see where that is, progress. And so I think what's so you have even on, and Kurzweil was chief technology guy at Google, which is a very much a left-leaning firm. So, again, I think what we make the mistake is companies have their strategies, but their mentality is the most important issue. And look, it's a very natural thing. And again, Bell made this point very clearly. If your success is based on your ability to manipulate technology, then you think that that's the future. That's that. You're good at this, so we're going to uh, you're going to think that's the most important thing. Just like, I assume a evangelical preacher thinks that belief in God is the key to everything. They believe belief in technology is the key to everything. And I think that this is again very scary, and it's not necessarily just in the hands of the existing oligarchs. It could be in the hands of somebody we never even heard of. Who heard of Nvidia 10 years ago?
If you could, since you mentioned Curtis Yarvin, there was an article that came out, I believe, today or yesterday from the New York Times. Elon Musk consulted Curtis Yarvin, right-wing thinker, on third party. This third party, I guess Musk is calling it the America Party. If I have listeners that are unfamiliar with Curtis Yarvin, what makes him such a scary character? You cover him a bit in the article.
Well, I mean, obviously, I don't consider myself necessarily an expert on him, but I've seen what he said. I mean, this is somebody who almost parallel to the eugenics arguments of the early in the last century. Certain groups are never going to make it. We don't, we don't want these defective people around. And he and this some of the other ones will say, well, and this is why, I would say Elon Musk is an engineering genius and a political imbecile. Because you're listening to people whose whole strategy is completely opposite the demographic trends of the United States. What are you going to say? You're going to say all the Hispanics are we don't need them, or we shouldn't even appeal to them. This is insanity. I
I
mean,
think that's one of your big points, by the way. Just for my listeners, you say that, and I think Michael Lynch has said this too, that MAGA's agenda can't be completed without a multiracial,
yes.
working and lower middle class being part of it. And then you have these sort of nativists like Steve Siller, Razib Khan, and these people like Ron Unz who are very much just race obsessed in a way that's going to hurt that coalition.
And of course, the race obsession, as we know from the British Empire in the late 19th, early 20th century, American eugenics, and look, Hitler looked at American eugenics policy as one of the role models. What you clearly have is you have this mentality of really very very much of categorizing by race. Well, just as I object to DEI and I object to quotas and all that, I object to identifying people by group and saying this group is superior and this group is inferior, so we want more of those. First of all, history is full of changes. It's like the idiot, settler colonial idea. Well, this group colonized that group. But well, how about the group that colonized them? And like for instance, you can say, well, the Israelis displaced the Arabs. Well, the Arabs, the Muslim Arabs replaced the Christian Arabs, and then the Turks conquered them. I mean, history is a progression of change. And again, if you look at the eugenics argument, if you took the eugenics argument of 1920, you would think, well, the best thing we could do in America is get rid of, the Poles, the Jews, the Chinese, and the Italians, and then everything will be better. Well, those groups all outperformed and somewhat by a large margin the overall population. So what I think tends to happen is people take a statistical snapshot and then project it over time, where history is always about, my sense of it, I take the inspiration from Ibn Khaldun, the great Arab historian, who made the point that, there's this progression. And, what might be the ascendant group in 1905 might be very different in 1945 and might be very different in 2045. And I think that there's this desire to somehow, like, we can somehow manage humanity's progress by using scientific tools. And I think that it can be helpful, but humanity's progress has to be based on humanistic principles. And I think that's what's missing. I mean, look, I don't mean to cast aspersions, but some guy who has numerous children that are from different women who they select. I mean, I'm just saying, I don't get that. I mean, maybe I'm just an old-fashioned Jewish guy from New York, which may be my undoing. But I think that there's something missing in the tech world in terms of human values, in terms, not everybody in that industry, but there's a tendency to reward what I would think is very dehumanizing ways of looking at things, and how can we replace people even when people might actually be better? Like, you know, I mean, eventually you could have a world where you don't need people to answer the phone when you're trying to make travel arrangements. Well, yeah, I mean, a computer can kind of do it, but if you've tried to book through a computer, sometimes it doesn't work so well. Sometimes you want to talk to a human being. Those values are gone because everything becomes efficiency, and only the rich then are able to afford personal services. And the rest of us schmucks are forced to rely on technology. And this is the kind of world that we're going. It's almost like we're in this dark tunnel, and we're going incredibly fast in this dark tunnel with no idea where it's leading, and nobody even saying, well, what's the end game here? And I think the end game has to be, greater opportunity for people, greater satisfaction in their lives, and a fundamental respect for human beings, no matter whatever their IQ is. This idea that somehow IQ or how well you did on a test should determine who should breed and who shouldn't breed is insane and dehumanizing.
I think it's
And I
also
think,
deeply like anti-Christian. I mean, I think it's against any religious orthodoxy, whether you're Christian, Jewish, Muslim. I mean,
oh, or Buddhist or Hindu. I mean, it is fundamentally anti-humanism, and that's the essence of eugenics. It's anti-human. It's valuing humans based on some formula about what this group scores on a test, or how much money they have. And I think that look, I'm no socialist. I don't, and I'm not, and I certainly don't want to see massive redistribution of wealth. But I think you that this society is headed to a very disastrous conclusion if we continue in this path of incredible economic concentration, which then also leads to dominance of technology, and again, in a relatively small number of companies.
If I could, I just had maybe one or two more questions. The first was, if I have a conservative that's listening to this specific conversation I'm having with you, I think maybe you could reach out to them in a certain way, uh, because you've written for outlets that are more or less considered conservative, but I don't. I'm not saying you. I think you resist that sort of labeling yourself, but I think you can speak to some of these conservatives in the sense of when it comes to a lot of MAGA or MAGA adjacent thinkers, I think there's this tendency by some to say, well, I hate wokeness and, woke is bad. But then they'll say that because woke is bad, I'm going to start dabbling in maybe the idea that, oh, maybe slavery was good because woke is bad, slavery was good. You point this out with Yarvin, right? He seems to
Right.
have a soft spot for slavery. What would you say to people that are falling down these sort of rabbit holes where they're going so far into like, I hate woke that they're now accepting some of these really noxious ideas?
Well, that's pretty well put. Let me put it this way. I think that again, these are not people who, generally speaking, have a great deal of knowledge of history. I mean, one of the great changes I've noticed in Silicon Valley over the years, I was one of the first people covering it in the 70s. And a lot of the great venture capitalists, like Don Valentine, for instance, were extensive readers of history. Others had worked with other people in companies. Now you have increasingly MBAs. Everything is based on numbers. But the problem is that when you start going down these rabbit holes as you describe, then you just say, I'm not going to read. Look, the Guardian. A lot of what the Guardian says is insane, but sometimes they have a good point. I even look at, let's say, Jacobin. Now, I disagree with them on a lot of things, but sometimes they make a good point. This what I will say, and I feel very strongly about this. I came up working mainly in mainstream media, New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times. Increasingly, those publications are just not really that interested in an open discussion of things. The reason I write for, and I don't know if I would call UnHerd and Spiked conservative per se, but they're open. National Review is open to different things. The sort of establishmentarian lock, which is being broken, is mostly on the left, and very. I mean, there are like I mean, I remember going through Neo-Feudalism, which did very well as a book. But I couldn't get arrested at the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times on that book. I remember one time it was really sort of funny. They did it. American Prospect did something on neo-feudalism. I invented the word. I'm pretty sure, and they never even mentioned my book because they only took left-wing writers. And you see some of that on the right. Fortunately, I would say that the conservative press is a little bit more open to good ideas. I mean, if you think about it, I mean the desire to regulate speech is coming more from the left than from the right, which is where it used to come from. So I just think we're in a very odd situation right now, and my greatest hope on the media side is, places like Spiked, UnHerd, Free Press does some very good things. Would you call Free Press conservative? Well, if you're a doctrinaire progressive, yes. If you're a conservative, probably say no. And I think that somehow I think you're completely right that we've gone down these rabbit holes. And so I think that the problem is that what technology is doing through the internet and now through AI is making things increasingly um, tailored to your worldview. And what I find most discouraging,
Everything is sort of decided by the algorithm that's fed to us, and the algorithm's feeding us what we want to hear.
Right. And one of the things like I think is missing with people not reading books, books are full of all sorts of interesting nuance and you have to imagine in your head what this looked like and what this felt like. Well, AI just takes all that away from you. All you become is you just get this receptacle of information. And what I find just astounding is college students, and I've been teaching them on and off for many years. They know so little now in terms of what they actually learned on their own. So, so the discussion we're having doesn't make any sense because they never studied the history. Maybe they got a progressive approach to this, not understanding that some of the worst eugenics took place in so-called socialist countries. So I think that somehow this this sort of attempt to try to put everybody in a particular camp is just disastrous. And I think that there's it's really it's a sad situation, and of course it's made worse by the fact that so much of the media is now owned by the oligarchs, and works on whatever their particular obsessions are.
I just had two more brief questions. I know we're running a little bit long, but I thought this was important to bring up. As I said before, I think some people will try to pigeonhole you as being a conservative thinker. But one thing that I've noticed that a lot of people don't realize is that, during 2024 in the election, you were critical of both Harris and Trump. And I think you warned
Right.
that both were pushing phony populism. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that, the sort of phony populism problem on both the Democratic side and the Republican side, and
Sure.
maybe what are your concerns with Trump? Because I think that gets overlooked. You haven't always been you're not a cheerleader necessarily for Trump.
No, well, first of all, I'm a New Yorker, so I know who I'm dealing with. And look, Trump is a bit of a charlatan, a showman. Um, he, I mean, I think he was brilliant in understanding that a large proportion of the American population had been left behind by both parties. And so I give him credit for seeing that. Whether he's doing anything to really improve people's conditions, I don't know. Because you think about it, who is he surrounded by? He's surrounded by a bunch of billionaires. They
Yeah,
may
when
be
you
a
wrote
little
that
more,
article I mentioned, you were talking at the time he was the phony populism of Harris and Trump article is the article I'm referring to. Musk was aligning with him. Yeah.
right, exactly, exactly. And I think that so I think that it's really, I think I think he's a unique character, but I think that I'm not sure whether people will do better or not. I mean, a lot of it depends on how the tariffs come out. But and I think there will be some positive impact from some of what he's doing. But fundamentally, Trump is a guy surrounded by very rich people, and he looks at the world the way very rich people do, which is not necessarily bad, but it's a far way from populism. Let me put it this way: he's a long way from William Jennings Bryan. I'll put it that way, who was in many ways a person who did understand those changes, and he never made it all the way, but he came from that group. Now it's a little different with J.D. Vance, who I know. I don't know Trump, but I know Vance. He does come from that sort of working class white population. The Democrats are unbelievable hypocrites in many cases because people say, "Oh, the oligarchs, they're all lined up with Trump." Most of the oligarchs supported Harris, and you know, maybe Elon Musk gave more money than Bill Gates, but Bill Gates is certainly capable of giving it money. The Democrats have been getting enormous amount of money. Don't every time there's a race, almost every time, including the 2016 and 2024 elections, Democrats had much more money. So, I mean, they're really, they're playing a cynical game. Now, I will, I agree with you that I think Bernie in particular, Bernie Sanders, was identifying the issues. I'm not necessarily in favor of his solutions, but I think he identified the issues. But then, this shift on all these cultural issues wiped out any chance of really connecting with working class voters. So what you end up with is the big socialist in New York gets the votes of well-to-do hipsters. That's his base. I don't know. Somehow, I don't think that's the way Marx thought about it.
Closing out here, the last thing I wanted to ask you, and I thought this was very important because I was thinking about it throughout the whole Beware the New Eugenics article was you mentioned like reading places like Jacobin, not necessarily agreeing with a lot of the things they say, but even Jacobin has talked about this eugenics stuff. I
Yes,
know that they wrote a whole piece a while back on the medically assisted deaths in Canada and how
yes, yes.
that's a slippery slope to eugenics. And I kind of wonder if we're moving into this era where things aren't going to necessarily be defined by left versus right. Uh, and maybe they'll be defined by human versus anti-human. I feel like that's where we're moving towards in this sort of tech dystopia. What do you think of that? Am I off base? Is that possible?
Oh well, no, I think it's happening. That's part of why when I'm working on this book now is I'm trying to understand what that trajectory is, and I don't think it's a left or right trajectory necessarily. It's really what really matters. I mean, at the end of the day, what really matters? And to me, what really matters to me would, and I think to most people in their lives, would be their children, their wives, their closest friends, their community, the historical trajectory of their ethnic group, their religious affiliations. That's what makes humanity worthwhile. I mean, I don't, do you really want to end up like one of those characters in Brave New World, you know, where, free drugs and free sex? Oh, well, I'll buy that. But what's left? What happens to humanity? You're just being manipulated to sort of fulfill your basic needs. Like when I think about the world that many of these people want is, well, we'll have this ruling class of the extraordinarily gifted who control and understand these technologies, and then everybody else, well, until they die out because they won't have kids, will they can live in a one-bedroom apartment that's subsidized or with rent control, and they can smoke as much pot as they want, and they can hang out with their animals and their plants and watch porn all day. Okay, somehow that doesn't seem to me to be the inspiration for a better humanity.
I know I said last question, but since you mentioned Brave New World multiple times, I have to ask. I've often said to people, in some ways, I think Huxley was more on point than even Orwell was. How important do you think it is that
Absolutely.
we look back at Brave New World?
I've actually taught a class based on Brave New World. So um, I would say there's really what Orwell was dealing with was sort of working class 1940s Britain. I always remember the smell of the cabbages and things like that, and you know, and I also my daughter was in the play 1984, so I mean, it's a very harsh, it's very much a Stalinist view, and probably the realities maybe of sort of late Nazi Germany, and even a little bit of fascist Italy. The Italians are too human to go all the way. But it would seem to me that what he got right was, first of all, I think a lot of it was because Huxley came to California, and in California he got to see what was emerging in a relatively prosperous society. Um, and I think also because of his family background with biology, I think he understood technology more. Except for surveillance, there's not a lot of technology in 1984. Actually, I think the more prophetic book is Animal Farm, because because what he talks about there is the takeover in the name of the people of a new tyranny. That I think he was totally correct. Um, but Huxley got it. I mean, in a weird way. Not that Huxley was wrong about a lot of things, but he was very right about that. And I think this idea of the pleasure principle, that you can get more out of people if you titillate them than if you repress them. And I think that the controllers in Brave New World are the archetype for the people who may control our destiny in the next 20 or 30 years.
It's become that way too, with even with our media. Like we don't even really talk about politics anymore. It's almost like politics is spectacle. It's the pleasure
Yes.
principle as applied to politics. We just have talking heads, and it's like I'm on Team Maddow or I'm on Team Tucker Carlson, and it's there's no actual like discussion. It's treating politics as a football game
Well,
for entertainment.
well, that's one of the reasons why I'm predominantly writing for British publications, because there's still a desire for analysis. And, my editors don't say, well, we want you to say this, or we want you to say that. Um, and I think in this country there are some that are better than others. Again, I certainly would look at free press as being a good example of something that could be done. Um, and the great thing about the internet is that if you write in English, it gets distributed. So if my editor happens to be in London or Sydney or Toronto, it doesn't matter. It's in English and it goes out on the net, and it reaches people. So, I think that that's actually quite a good thing. But the I mean, like, what I want, like, I like to read something where I'm saying I'm going to learn something. To me, that's the number one thing when I read an article. Is not whether I agree with it or not. Did I learn something? Did I think about something different? Did I get a data point I hadn't considered before? And that spirit is very much lacking in contemporary journalism in the United States. And you can blame the mainstream media, and you can blame Donald Trump also. Um, and it's a tragedy, because as we're moving in this very rapid pace down this dark tunnel, um, what we really need is a little bit of light and a little bit of understanding of where we're going and what we might not want and where we might not want to go.
Well, thank you so much, Joel Kutkin. That's a really great note to end on. I think it's a little bit more hopeful, which I appreciate. Thank you so much, and how can my listeners keep up with your work?
But I have a mailing list. If you email me at probably the best thing is email my wife, who controls everything, Seamus at yahoo.com, or Mandy at joelkotkin.com. And then and again, I'm mostly UnHerd, Spiked, sometimes National Review, sometimes City Journal, National Post in Canada, and those are places where you tend to find the Telegraph. I do quite a bit for them. But the best thing is if you email us, we'll put you on the mailing list. We send out a newsletter every week or two. Um, One thing I don't want to do is, like I see with Substack, where people feel they have to post every day. I don't want to hear from anyone every day.
Well, hey, thank you again, Joel, for coming on Parallax Views. And next time we'll have to talk a little bit more about Charles Bronson. But thanks so
Okay,
much.
and if you could send me a tape,
No, will do. Yeah.
that would be great.
This edition of Parallax Views brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, WV, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Darko, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mark M, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, JC, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.